Chapter 27. As Reuben and Daniel desperately continued the search, they were interrupted suddenly by the sound of trumpets in the distance. The castle guards responded by sounding their own trumpets. "The battle has begun anew," Daniel said solemnly. Confusion swept over the castle. Those who had been searching for intruders now took the defensive positions. Reuben ran out into the outer courtyard and up the stone flight to the top of the wall near the gate. Daniel was just behind him. Reuben was relieved to see that the enemy's armies had not yet gathered in the area that was once the village. However, he could see from their torches, moving in the distance, that they were forming ranks, preparing to march. Moreover, there was a lot of action around the war machines. The wind was growing fiercer now, and the storm was nearly upon them. All communication had to be shouted to be heard.
"It is not safe on these walls," Daniel yelled. "The men could be struck by lightning."
"The walls give us a huge advantage in combat," Reuben said. "We have no choice."
Reuben quickly scanned the wall. It seemed that his men were in position. There was still no sign of the king or the intruders. Reuben assigned men to take over positions in Hezekiah's tunnel and warned them to be especially vigilant.
"We believe the location of the tunnel has been compromised," he explained.
There was a short trumpet blast in the enemy camp.
"A signal!"
Reuben shouted. Then they saw what it was about. A volley of stones had been fired from the catapults.
"Take cover!"
he called, and he himself crouched behind the wall. But as the stones began to hail on the castle, the walls did not shake, nor did they hear the sound of impact. One flew right into the inner court, and even over the wind the screams of terror of the villagers could be heard. There was another blast, and another volley. This time Reuben watched as one of the stones hit a tower and seemed to crawl up the wall and enter the tower through a window.
"Mazakim,"
Daniel said.
"They're firing Mazakim at us."
"Unbelievable,"
Reuben said. Then he yelled to his men,
"Shoot them out of the air!"
After the next trumpet, he watched the bombardment come in. About 6 Mazakim silhouetted on the night sky. He and his men took aim and shot. Several were hit. Another died on impact as it collided with the wall. However, Reuben saw at least one survive the short flight, land in the outer courtyard in a roll, then quickly get to its feet and disappear into the shadows. By now, the castle was in complete disorder. Men were abandoning their posts due to fear of lightning or Mazakim. Most of the army was assembled in the outer court, waiting for instructions, while their commander was not even there. Villagers were screaming and running every which way to escape the monsters in the dark. The archers on the wall were now aiming their bows into the castle and towards the tower and along the wall. One, screaming in terror, fell headlong from a tower window, while his pursuer grinned from above. And the king was nowhere to be seen. Then Reuben saw Sarah, accompanied by Eli, marching hurriedly across the courtyard. Reuben and Daniel descended the steps and met with them in consultation.
"Sarah killed an intruder in her room," Eli told them. "I apologize, Your Majesty. He came through the tunnel," Reuben said.
"Do we know if there are any more?"
Daniel asked. "I don't believe so," Sarah said. "I knew the man from when I was in the enemy camp. He is an assassin. I'm sure he works alone. His job was to kill my father in the event that the dragon's plan to form an alliance didn't work." Reuben and Daniel exchanged a look, but said nothing. "Do you know where my father is?" Sarah asked.
"I'm afraid we don't,"
Daniel said. "Well, in that event, I suppose it is up to us to rule in his absence," Sarah said calmly. There was a moment of silence before Daniel said,
"Well, I suppose that I am the senior official."
"Under the circumstances, I believe Sarah is,"
Reuben said. The circumstances being that if the king dies, the next of kin inherits the throne, and the king was presumed dead. Neither Reuben nor anyone else wanted to mention that detail. Throughout this conversation, the chaos around them only increased. People panicked and fled from every shadow. The storm grew closer. Here and there another victim fell to the Mazakim. Fortunately, there was a momentary reprieve from the barrage of Mazakim. "Our first priority must be to restore order and protect the people," Sarah said. "Get every villager into the inner court where they are contained. Eli, you and your special operations team will be in charge of protecting them from the Mazakim. I will also assign the police to you. Light a large bonfire to cast a lot of light and diminish the hiding places for Mazakim." "Bonfires are my speciality," Eli grinned. "Reuben, you are of course in charge of the guards," Sarah went on. "They must maintain their positions." Another trumpet sounded in the distance, the signal to fire.
"I'd hoped they'd run out of Mazakim,"
Reuben said.
Take cover!
A guard on the wall yelled. Villagers and soldiers alike ran into the very shadows they had been heretofore avoiding. But it was not Mazakim or stones that rained upon the village this time. It was human heads, the heads of the soldiers and villagers who had been killed in the earlier battles. A new kind of terror gripped the people, a horror and a sorrow.
"They are trying to break our will,"
Daniel said. "Daniel, you will have to be in charge of the army," Sarah instructed.
Daniel looked concerned. "Of course. I'll do anything you tell me, but I am not a warrior. I am a scholar. I understand the theory of war, but have never handled a weapon."
Sarah looked at the man, still in his nightrobe and hat. She shook her head. "All right, Daniel," Sarah said. "You are in charge of the castle. I myself will lead the army." No one objected to this last suggestion. Each set about restoring order and instructing the soldiers and guards in what was to happen. It was found that each man was so grateful for a plan and leadership that they gladly obeyed. Sanballat grinned to himself. The terror stage over, there was still one more move to completely break the will of the people in the castle. He gave the signal. The drums started their rhythmic beat. Doom, 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 doom. The 4 dragons strained against their harnesses, driven by whips and dragging the great statue of Molech. The furnace inside the statue blazed such that the fire leaped from its mouth and from its very eyes. Sanballat could see the soldiers and villagers amassing on the walls, watching to see what would happen next. He would ensure that they had a good view. It took the dragons some time to get the great statue into position. But the suspense served them well. As the statue advanced, so did the armies. They moved in formation across the destroyed village. Now the statue was in place. An old bell tower was all that remained on the scarred landscape of the village. The bell had been a symbol of hope and joy for the people. Now the tower would serve as the perfect platform from which to offer sacrifices to Molech. Sanballat ascended the staircase inside the tower and surfaced alongside the bell. From there he could see inside the castle. Moreover, if he shouted, he could be heard. He would clearly tell the people of Moriah who would be their greater king. He assumed the role of general and priest. He took the priest's headdress, a bull skull decorated with feathers and red paint, and placed it on his own head. He had the fur cape draped around his shoulders, giving him the appearance of great size. Added to that were the necklaces and the staff of the priest. He raised the staff over his head. The drums stopped. The wind still whispered past, but had lost some of its power. The storm itself paused to see what would happen next. Sanballat raised his arms theatrically and said loudly,
"Oh, great Molech! We've come to offer the sacrifice. May the strength and power of these great warriors be added unto your own, and may you empower us to do thy bidding. We are your servants, O Dark Lord, and we claim Moriah for you, and it is to be your kingdom. We offer you the first fruits of our inevitable victory. Grant us success this day, and you will have many more sacrifices."
Sanballat knew well that the body of Molech had been found dead in a cave. However, he understood the hearts of men, and the great motivator that fear was. This sacrifice to him was no more than a ruse, but to his superstitious followers, and those in the castle, it would have great effect. The drums started in once more, and Sanballat yelled,
"Bring me the prisoners!"
3 guards now approached the bell tower, dragging a man with a black bag over his head. The prisoner struggled and fought, tried to yell, and succeeded in whimpering. The people of Moriah would now watch their great commander as his legs and courage failed him before the power of their insurmountable enemy. Sanballat relished the moment. However, Once the guards got the prisoner to the platform, he whispered to them,
"You were told to bring all of the prisoners at once. Send for the others."
A terrified guard answered him,
The others are missing, sir."
Sanballat was furious at this news, but he knew that both his army and the people of Moriah were watching his every move. He did not betray the fact that his guards were incompetent. Over the beat of the drums, Sanballat yelled,
"People of Moriah, behold your general!"
So saying, he dramatically tore the black bag off the man's head, and he and his guards immediately recognized the weeping man as one of their own. Before anyone could react, Sanballat quickly raised his club and knocked the man into the mouth of the statue, where his screams were heard only for a moment in the flames. Then, with fury in his eyes, he said to his guards,
"You too will be sacrificed."
Sanballat's soldiers saw to it that they were unable to escape. It took some doing, but eventually Sarah, Eli, Reuben, and Daniel succeeded in herding the majority of the people back into the inner court. Most of the people were looking for vantage points to watch the spectacle of the sacrifices. That over, they returned to the relative safety of the inner court. The court was contained and quickly surrounded by soldiers who would ensure that the Mazakim could not get to the people. This was not an easy task. Mazakim would not be limited to the traditional entrances the humans had used, but could climb right up many of the walls or leap through high windows and land without injury. Their ability was even greater than had been initially estimated. The terror of the people was poignant. There seemed now to be an expectation of certain death, one way or another. Some scoffed when they realized that Sarah herself would be leading the army or that Daniel would have charge of the castle. Where were the king and queen? It seemed suspicious that no one knew. It was even speculated by some that perhaps Sarah was working for the dragons after all, that she had brought intruders into the castle, murdered her parents, and would now lead the whole army into certain death. Eli worked most closely with the people and felt the tension, suspicion, and overall, the fear. He was trying to build a bonfire as requested, but was getting little cooperation from the villagers. Nonetheless, he managed to clear a space in the center of the inner court and brought hay and wooden carts and other structures and built a mound. "Stand back," he ordered the people. Some men who had been at the earlier fire helped Eli push the crowds further back. Then, raising a stick like a staff, Eli called on heaven, which seemed to hang very close indeed, and called down fire. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The heavy cloud above them continued to slowly rotate and grumble within. Then a bolt of lightning struck, right on the mound Eli had built. So close was the strike that the people screamed and again pushed to get out of the courtyard. Reuben himself, not in the inner court, fell to his knees where he stood and covered his head at the sound of the thunder. But now the fire ignited. The inner court was warmer and brighter, and the shadows flickered and were less menacing. At first there was a slow applause, which grew then into roars of cheers. Heartened, Sarah addressed them from a balcony which overlooked the inner court from the throne room. Daniel stood beside her. "People of Moriah," she began, "listen to me, your princess, and perhaps your queen. For many years now, evil forces have plotted against us, to destroy us. We have lived content in our security and order. They would have no order, no security. This is what they are fighting for. They may have already captured or killed the king, my father, and his wife, the queen. However, the people of Moriah must not abandon hope. For too long we have let our guard down, leaving the fighting to soldiers and trained professionals. But this is not how the kingdom was once won, and it is not how it shall be held today. We have enough weapons for all of you. Everyone, men, women, even the children and the elderly, must be called on to fight this day. The battle has been brought to our very door. We must succeed. Do not say you are too young. Do not say you are too weak, or infirm, or blind. This day, Moriah will empower you to defeat the enemy. Eli will teach us all how to allow Moriah to use us, and we will be victorious." A cheer then went up from the people. Though some doubted, all agreed that this was their only hope. If the power of Moriah meant that they could control the very storm or call down fire from heaven, there would be no stopping them. The guards brought weapons out and distributed them among the people. Though many had never handled a sword, trained soldiers taught them the basics quickly. Eli went from group to group, along with his special operations team, and taught them the essentials about the power of Moriah. Like their use of swords, the villagers would have to refine their skills later. "The power of Moriah is already available to all of you, by right of being a member of the kingdom," Eli explained. "It was never intended to be reserved for a select few. Just as we must all fight for the kingdom, so the power to do so is for all of us. But do not misunderstand me. It would be oversimplifying things to say that the power is within you. It is within you. It pervades you, but it is not a part of you, and neither is it yours. Unlike a weapon, you cannot wield it. Rather, you must make yourself a weapon for it, and it must wield you." While all of this was happening, the guards took back their positions on the walls, and Sarah spoke to the soldiers who were gathered in the outer court. Daniel watched these developments from the king's balcony and saw something new. The Mazakim that had been invading were now fleeing the castle in terror. Tobias, Gideon, Joab, and Jeroboam watched with satisfaction as Sanballat sacrificed his own guards. Then, along with the other soldiers they had freed, they returned to the forest to consider their next move.
"War is imminent," Joab said. "We do not have time to get back to the castle. Perhaps it would be to our advantage to rout the army from behind."
"With 10 men?" Jeroboam was incredulous.
9, Joab corrected, "but 9 they are not expecting. If we can get more weapons, maybe a crossbow or two, we can fire on them from the rear."
"That's a lot of ifs," Jeroboam said.
"Yes, but maybe it will give our side enough of an advantage to be victorious in the end," Joab said.
"What choice do we have?" Tobias said. "I know where to find their spare weapons," Gideon said. "After they arrested us, they paraded us around the camp, announcing that we were to be sacrificed. In the forest on the far side of the clearing is where their civilians were camped."
"They brought them into battle?"
Joab asked. "I don't think they're expected to fight," Gideon said. "The dragons were so confident of their victory that they brought all their people and belongings and left them back in the woods. I bet their weapons are among them." "All right," Tobias said. "Here's the plan. Once war breaks out, we break into the civilian camp and take whatever weapons we can find. From there, we begin firing on the enemy from behind." "Attack from a civilian camp?" Jeroboam said. "Think of the casualties."
"Sanballat would likely use our civilians as shields," Joab said.
"Nonetheless, it would be immoral for us to use that tactic," Tobias said. "No, once we have the weapons, we move back into this forest to attack." Just then, lightning appeared to strike right within the castle walls. There was silence for a moment, then the sound of cheering from within the castle.
"It will waste a lot of time, especially crossing the clearing without being seen," Joab said. "We'd better start moving."
Chapter 28. Sanballat was furious. His incompetent guards had let his prisoners escape. The flash of lightning startled everyone, but somehow it seemed to have served to rally the castle. Whatever effect his campaign of terror had in demoralizing them seemed to be wearing off. And here Mazakim could be seen, now running like dogs, now hobbling like injured men, retreating to his army.
"Kill them!"
he ordered his archers, and they shot the retreating Mazakim. But he knew that in the end he must win the battle for their minds if he was to win the war. He ordered the furnaces in the statue to be stoked once more. A trumpet sounded, and his army turned their attention on him. He placed the ritual headdress back on his own head, raised his arms in the air, and addressed the statue.
"O great Molech,"
he declared,
"we are in solidarity with you. Now we will march on Moriah, and it will be yours. Rise with us, Molech. We call upon you now. Rise and be our master.
The drums and the flames were choreographed perfectly to create the appearance of a response from the statue.
Now, Sanballat yelled. Charge!
Trumpets sounded. His army began the charge, all moving together in such a way that the very earth shook beneath them. But the tremor grew beyond the impact of the soldiers. The bell tower began to sway, and the bell to ring of its own accord. The marching soldiers stopped and tripped over one another, and Sanballat raced down the stairs of the tower and came clear of it before it collapsed. The earthquake grew in intensity as Sanballat and the others, unable to stand, grappled with the ground to lay flat. Rocks and men were thrown clear off the ground and crashed back into the earth as it itself rushed up to meet them. As all of this happened, the ground cracked and surged, and a great sinkhole appeared directly below the statue of Molech. The statue rolled backwards a bit, and the dragons, still harnessed to it, screeched as they were dragged backwards. They dug in their claws and pulled against their harnesses. The leather bindings snapped here and there, but then the ground below the statue seemed to fall out altogether, and the dragons were drawn backwards into the hole. Their screams disappeared, and the earthquake subsided. Sanballat and his men stood cautiously, braced for an aftershock. The great chasm that had suddenly appeared was lit from somewhere within by an orange-red light. A couple of men crept towards its edge on the uncertain surface of the ground to look in, and suddenly withdrew as something began crawling out of the hole. First one foreleg, then another, of an immense dragon rose out of the earth. As it surfaced, and the man closest ran in terror, it towered over them all. Even the great statue whose place it had taken was only a fraction the size of this behemoth. In its shape it was like a dragon, or rather it seemed that all dragons were like it, as if it was the prototype, the model for all future dragons. Indeed, now it looked like Ra, now Molech, now Mammon. In color it was black, not like the other black dragons or lizards, but a true black. There was no shine, no reflection, nothing which could help you distinguish that the creature was three-dimensional or material at all. It seemed as though a dragon-shaped hole in space had opened up and was now moving about the surface of the earth. Even against the night sky, black as it was clearly distinguished. The stars near its silhouette seemed to dim by mere proximity, as though it were not merely the absence of light, but was absorbing the light itself. A third of the stars were extinguished in the presence of the dragon. Sanballat saw that even the torches of his soldiers flickered in an eerie, superficial way. It was as though the creature were not of the same substance as the material around it, as though it in fact was insubstantial. And yet, it seemed to exist on a higher plane than the mere material world, which was little more than a farce or a cardboard scene for a play. It seemed to breathe in a sense, but its breath lacked life in the same manner that its color lacked light. A mist like a very dark smoke snaked from its nose and jaws. Its breath fell on the men nearest to it, so that the air itself seemed to take on a quality akin to the dragon. It smelled of death, not of rot, but of cool, clean death. And as one breathed it in, one felt terror and hatred and something darker than both. It was exhilarating, and Sanballat drank it in. He felt himself being transformed, as if by some sort of inner power. He began to see things differently, as though he were now in the dark with the dragon, looking out on the bright world. Torches were no longer necessary. The castle in the distance, and even the storm cloud above it, emanated some sort of a light against his darkness. He could feel himself being overcome by a sense of lust for destruction and blood. He looked and perceived that his whole army was going through a similar transformation. They stared hungrily at the castle, their features contorted, their eyes large and gleaming, distorted subhumans, and he was one of them. And they and he were all a part of the darkness that was the great dragon. The dragon spoke then, a horrible voice which consisted of several voices at once, and yet sounded hollow, as if nothingness itself was in the voice.
I am Molech, whom you have called, and promised to serve. Now you are mine. Attack!
The army moved as one, as though each individual had forfeited his will. They surged towards the castle like a wave towards rocks, and though they would be dashed to pieces, they did not stop. Tobias was leading the way across the clearing when the earthquake struck. He and the others watched in awe as the statue fell into the chasm, and an immense dark dragon crawled out of the hole in its place. Even from their vantage point, they could see the darkness spread over the enemy army. A transformation was taking place, and suddenly the army was running, not marching, at the castle, apparently unconcerned about the arrows being flung from its walls. "Move," Joab said. "We need those weapons now." The men got to their feet and ran, no longer concerned with being discreet. They came in through the edge of the forest and found the camp. It appeared to have been abandoned. Fires still burned low, food still in the pots, but no one remained. It was not difficult under the circumstances to find the armor and weapons where they had been stashed. The men distributed swords, shields, armor, bows, and arrows among themselves. But as they were doing so, Tobias began noticing small, subtle movements in the forest around them. "Stand up straight," Tobias ordered his men. "We're being watched." The men stood among the weapons, their backs to one another, and suddenly it was apparent that there were dozens, no hundreds, of wide-eyed, tired-looking, dirty-faced women and children surrounding them. They approached silently, staring, slowly, though their faces betrayed no fear. "I was not counting on battling children," Gideon said, "though from the looks of these, they are no ordinary children." "Hold your fire," Tobias instructed. A woman stepped towards them, staring hauntingly. She stopped a few feet away as the other women and children continued to close in. "My name is Italia," the woman said. "Please, help us." Stunned, Tobias was speechless. Jeroboam spoke. "You know that we are from the castle, and we have come to fight against your husbands and fathers." "Those men are not our husbands," Italia said, "and though they've impregnated us, they are no fathers to our children." "Please," another woman begged, "we would rather die fighting for you than live under their rule any more." The soldiers lowered their weapons. "Is it a trick?" Jeroboam whispered to Tobias. "I don't think so," Tobias answered. "A decision needs to be made," Joab said. "All right," Tobias said. "We need all the help we can get. Everybody, grab a weapon." Reuben watched in horror the spectacle of the great dragon coming out of the earth. This creature would undoubtedly be harder to battle, if not impossible. He looked back to where Daniel stood on the balcony. Daniel, too, had a look of stunned horror on his face, and yet there was something familiar about the dragon to him. He had seen something like it, or perhaps had seen its opposite. Now the trumpets were sounding, and the enemy charged across the village ruins. They carried no torches now, but ran with an agility and style not unlike that of an animal. They darkened the space between the castle and the dragon. Within moments they were in range. "Fire!" Reuben shouted, and a volley of arrows fell among the enemy. Though some fell, others continued to run, even with arrows protruding from their arms or legs. "Fire at will!" Reuben shouted. He looked to where Sarah sat, mounted on her horse. They would have to charge, as they had done under Joab. Enemy men arrived at the walls and began scaling them even without the aid of a ladder. Reuben's guards continued to shoot them off the walls, but it was clear that they would soon be overwhelmed. Behind the dark army, coming from the forest, torches were suddenly lit and began flooding towards the rear of the army. To Reuben's surprise, they attacked, and so the enemy found itself fighting on two fronts. Nevertheless, the Dark Ones did not fall easily, and the torch-lit army was disorganized and appeared to consist of poor fighters. Again, Reuben looked to Daniel for instructions. Daniel gave his head a nod, and Reuben ordered the castle gates to be opened. Sarah led her army through the gates and quickly met the enemy in battle. Just behind her was Eli and the villagers, all armed. The enemy's men fought like wild animals. Even with the combination of the three armies, the enemy still outnumbered them, and they seemed to be crazed, bent on killing and destroying, with no mind anymore to how it would end. The black dragon itself was a formidable enemy. Though several soldiers attacked it at once, None could defeat it, and many perished. Suddenly there was a sound of blasting trumpets, so loud that every man felt the vibration in his chest. There was a glare of light from the clouds, brilliant like lightning, and yet sustained. For a moment the whole battle stopped and watched. There, coming on the clouds, was King Melchizedek, riding upon Ruah. His white hair trailed behind him, and he held his sword pointed at his enemies, his mouth open in a battle cry. Queen Miriam, too, was charging, wearing armor and riding her own horse. Behind them was a host of soldiers, an army of light. Identifiable among the soldiers were Caleb, Deborah, and Ratzis, and others who had fallen during the recent battles. Michael also led a contingent of soldiers, and he was seen wearing his golden armor and carrying his sword. Amongst the armies there were fantastic creatures, and Daniel recognized the 4 creatures from the throne room among them. The light from this army was so brilliant that those in the darkness of the dragon could not bear to look. Screaming in horror, they fell on their faces and writhed as if blinded in an immense pain. But to Tobias and his army, looking upon the light did not bring pain or fear, but invigoration. If it could be said that the black dragon and its army embodied darkness, then the king and his army embodied light. The light overcame the darkness. The men and creatures of the dark seemed to wither before the light, and were unable to so much as raise their heads as they thrashed on the ground. The army of light rode over them, as if they were nothing more than uneven ground, and surrounded the great dragon itself. The dragon cursed and roared, yelling obscenities about injustice, the king's unworthiness, and ordering his army to fight. As Michael's contingent surrounded the dragon, Michael faced it and did battle. The dragon emitted a steam of black flames, which Michael deflected with his shield. It was clear that though the dragon fought viciously, intent on destroying the light, that it would not taste victory. Suddenly it seemed to look at something in the light, and pausing in its battle, it stretched its great wings and lifted above the crowd, then dove, jaws open, to take Queen Miriam. But Miriam stood her ground, and with a deftness and agility unknown to any of them, she plunged her sword into the dragon's head. The dragon screamed and was silent. And so the war was suddenly ended. Michael and Caleb and Deborah bowed to King Melchizedek and Queen Miriam, then to Tobias and Sarah, and they and the other hosts of light returned to their cloud, which lifted above them all, removing the army from view. The cloud evaporated, and suddenly it was daylight. Only the king and queen and the horse remained, with the people of Moriah and the scorched village littered with the dead. Chapter 29. The celebrations after the war lasted for a whole week. Though the people mourned their losses, they had caught a glimpse of the new state in which their loved ones lived. The village and, effectively, their economy and livelihood had been destroyed, but there was a newfound hope, unity, and faith in their leaders, which enabled them to build a greater village and, more importantly, a greater society. The newcomers, those who had lived among the dragons, were welcomed. While many of the fields had been burned, those that had not been bore an exceptional harvest that year, and the prevailing spirit of generosity made for fabulous feasting the whole week. The prisoners were brought before King Melchizedek, who gave them the option of becoming members of his kingdom. After all they had seen, there were many who still chose not to serve, and so they were ordered to return to the barren lands over the mountains. It was noted that the king had been quite merciful in letting them go from prison, but he could not be expected to allow them to live in the kingdom if they refused to submit to his rule. Tobias at first returned to his cottage, which had been burnt by the Mazakim. He worked to rebuild it, though the new one was even smaller and humbler than the first. No matter. This would be a place where he and Sarah could go to get away or to fish. After all, once married, he would be living in the castle. The week culminated with his marriage to Sarah, a celebration that was overseen by King Melchizedek. Their wedding was celebrated in Sarah's garden, in a small, private, intimate ceremony, before the celebration was moved to the throne room where the whole kingdom had gathered. Sarah wore a simple white dress with gold trim. Draped over her shoulders was Miriam's mantle, which was a wedding gift and shone brilliantly. There in the throne room, Melchizedek made an important announcement. "People of Moriah," he declared, The time has come for me to pass on from this land. In so doing, I pass on the kingship of the kingdom to my son, Tobias, and his wife, Sarah, will be his queen." The crowd did not know quite how to respond to this. Some cheered, but though they all loved Tobias and Sarah and would follow them without question, many murmured about the parting of their great king. Eli in particular spoke up. "But sire," he said, "say it is not so. This was your greatest victory yet. You can lead us into even greater victories still, and expand your kingdom." Melchizedek smiled and said, "No, that is not how it must be. Have faith, Eli. The time has come." Then to Tobias he said, "Kneel before me, my son." Stunned, Tobias obeyed and knelt before his king. Melchizedek removed the crown from his own head and placed it on Tobias's. Then he rose from his throne and, drawing Tobias to his feet, embraced him warmly. Then Miriam beckoned for Sarah to step forward, and she removed her crown and passed it to Melchizedek. He in turn gave the crown to King Tobias, saying, "You have taken her for your wife. Now crown her as your queen." Tobias placed the crown on Sarah's head and looked into her eyes, which streamed with tears. He repeated the wedding vows he had just made. "Sarah, I promise to be true to you. I freely give myself totally to you. I promise to be open to life with you. You are my wife, and you are my queen. I give my life to you, and would willingly die for you. I love you." And with that, they kissed. Melchizedek took Miriam by the hand and led her to the outer courtyard. Tobias and Sarah and the whole village followed. The courtyard had been beautifully decorated with garlands of flowers. In the outer court stood Reuben, who was himself adorned with a wreath of roses. Melchizedek mounted the great horse and helped Miriam up after him. She rode in front of him, and he held her as he sat comfortably on the bare back of Reuben. Sarah and Tobias blinked back tears of joy and pride as they watched the affection between Melchizedek and Miriam. No one asked them where they were going. Melchizedek gave some final instructions to the villagers to remain faithful to the truth, to defend the kingdom, to love one another, and to always obey and honor their king and queen. Then Melchizedek raised his hands and gave them a final blessing. He smiled then at his daughter, who was being held affectionately by her husband. For a moment their eyes met, and they communicated a message more intimate and beautiful than is expressible in words. Miriam, too, joined in their conversation. Then Melchizedek turned his gaze towards the northern sky, from where the storm had come. Reuben bowed his head, and, to the astonishment of all, 2 great white wings like those of a dove or a white eagle sprouted from his back and stretched. Reuben, Melchizedek, and Miriam flew off into the sky. There are those who say that perhaps it was a subtle change in color, or perhaps there was a new star, but in some sense it seemed as though the very sky itself received her king. After staring at the sky for some time, Tobias made a formal declaration that Eli was to be his prime minister. Then he gave instructions that Eli would rule in his absence, as he and his wife were to begin their married life by taking a trip out on the ocean Azalor, because he had many wonders to show her.